Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Yeah, I'm very excited to be able to talk about Buddhism and the self. And I think some of you I may have encountered when I was in India back in February. Great fond memories of my time there, particularly in the Mahabodhi temple in Bodh Gaya. So yeah, so as I say, I'm really excited to be giving this talk. What is it about the self that inspired me to give this talk? So really, for me, this when I encountered it, up until that point in my study of Buddhism, pretty much everything that I saw was it seemed sort of fit with how things were within my own life. You know, when I would encounter, say, the 5 precepts, I thought, well, I'm sort of already living this anyway, so this is fairly natural for me. And then I encountered this concept of the self within Buddhism, and it seemed to run counter to my own experience. It was a very kind of a jarring kind of encounter with this concept. So I want to explain a little bit about my own kind of self-concept, and then we'll look a little bit at what Buddhism says about the self subsequent to that. So I'll start with this concept. It's not within Buddhism, actually. It's a concept within philosophy, but it's this concept of solipsism. So this is the idea that you know, what do we really know is, or what can we potentially know as you know, what can we have very strong knowledge about. So one of the things we have a strong knowledge about is our own minds, because we to a certain extent have you know, it's within us. So we're very close to it, and therefore we can feel as if we understand that very well. And in contrast, things that are outside of our minds, things that are in the outside world, in the external world, that feels very contingent, you know. So an example of this would be with people that we meet, people that we talk to. So so we don't really know, although we might have some idea, but we don't really know what people are thinking, what they are feeling, you know, what emotions they have. We might be able to infer that from what we can see, but we actually directly don't really have that experience. So it's sort of it's contingent, really. And so this is sort of how I've kind of viewed myself up to this point. So looking back at my sort of experience in life, actually, I would say actually that it's only ever really been the experience of this particular existence that I have. Okay, so just unpack that a little bit. So it's in particular, I've never really experienced life through someone else's experience, or through someone else's sensations, or you know, their feelings, their emotions, right? So so what I'm talking about here is something that's very different, say, from empathy. So we can have empathy for someone. So if someone appears to be suffering, for instance, we can have empathy for the suffering that they are experiencing, but we don't know what the direct sensations are that they are experiencing. So this is actually what I mean about this feeling, at least, of separateness from the other, so the self and the other. And so to me, throughout a large part of my life, actually, or all of it essentially, selfhood, we can kind of call it selfhood. It feels to be a one true constant in my life. This is the feeling that I get from it. So so I can recall when I was in my teenage years, I think early teenage years, and I kind of asked myself this question. So why? The question was, why do I always experience the same me? Right. So I had a concept of me, and I had the concept that there was a continuity around that concept of me, and I kind of wanted to know why this me, you know, why is it I'm always experiencing this me? So in contrast, for instance, the experience hasn't been, you know, at various phases of my life. I haven't experienced different individuals, so I can see other individuals around me, and I've not experienced life through their eyes, for want of a better analogy. Even though you know, my body has changed. I was a teenager then, I'm an adult now, and you know, grown and everything like that. So things have changed, but there's this feeling, there's this sense of self as being a constant throughout that, essentially. And there's actually an even more kind of, I guess you could sort of say, troubling or perplexing kind of aspect to that, which is this thing about. So there was a separate question I asked myself, which is, why was I born into this me? You know, why was I not born into another individual? So why was I not? Why was the me, the selfhood, not experienced through some other individual? So it's a very kind of perplexing kind of question to kind of ask, and it sort of, because it sort of it makes it seem as though that there is a kind of that it's kind of it seems to be that self that I'm experiencing seems to occupy a very well, it seems to occupy a unique position, you know, within the existence I see around me. You know, there's you know, I can see material and objects and matter around me, and they all seem to exist in relation to each other, but relative to each other. There's no kind of you know, there's no sort of center of the universe. There's no, you know, important point in time necessarily. You know, these things are all relative. So it seems odd to me that experience and self should be so should be such a unique facet, and why me in particular. So this is very kind of perplexing kind of stuff when I was kind of growing up. So you can imagine, or maybe you can't. Maybe I need to explain a bit more about the Buddhist concept of self. But you can imagine when I encountered a different view of what it means to have selfhood, basically, that this would very much be very jarring. Like it would be it would cause me to sit up and think, there's something else going on here that I need to pay attention to. So to understand why I was so shocked when I started learning about Buddhism, let's understand a little bit about what Buddhism and the Buddha has said about the concept of self. And to do that, I'm going to draw from a few talks and other materials that I kind of looked at over the last few months or so that I've been studying Buddhism. I've been studying Buddhism now for a couple of years or so, actually. So I'm still finding my way through and understanding more and more about these concepts. So this is sort of a work in progress of my own understanding. So one talk in particular that Sanigarachi gave in 1970, the talk was called Individuality, True and False, and he talked about various aspects in terms of the concept of self. Okay, so he looked at this concept of alienated awareness. Okay, and he defined this as that we have awareness that we do have a self. Okay, which is the kind of concept I was talking about before, but we don't have the full awareness of everything that is going on for us. Okay, so we're not actually experiencing ourselves, including our complete selves, including our emotions, for instance, quite often. And this is, you know, for me actually, this concept of having less awareness, particularly around emotion, the rest of it is quite relevant to my own kind of journey as well. So it's interesting that he was picking up this idea that we might be alienated from our full awareness, basically. So this kind of creates a split within within us is two parts. So we have the experience that we are conscious of. So this is the conscious side of it, and then we have the parts of us that we don't really experience as such, but they are there. So this is kind of the subconscious aspect of ourselves. So there is a split. So you could also talk about that in technical terms as being unintegrated. It's an unintegrated way of being. And Sangharakshita also mentions this concept that we are in fact this bundle of selves. So there's this all these different selves are battling for kind of supremacy. And we can kind of see this actually in our lives. So for instance, as we grow up with with our parents and our siblings, we form a kind of concept of ourselves. In fact, that is when our self-concept comes into existence, is during childhood and adolescence. It grows over time. So when we're born, for instance, we don't really have a concept of self that is separate from our mothers, for instance, and then over time that concept becomes more and more clearly delineated. But in fact, the way we are in relation to our close family, we sort of play that out throughout our lives. So actually, when we might leave home in our teens or maybe our 20s or whatever, and when we return, even though in our work life, in our subsequent kind of family life, we might be a different person, different self. We may revert to the way that we were as children, actually, when we're in the presence of our parents, for instance, just because of the way that we're conditioned. So our conditioning comes to the fore, and that's really what kind of causes this kind of this selfhood is conditioning. Okay, that's really what we're kind of talking about there. So we have different selves for different contexts. So in work, for instance, or with our friends, we may be different. There may be different aspects to ourselves. So we're not. So there's a very different kind of, in a sense of individuals. So to become integrated then is basically to acknowledge these different aspects of ourselves. Okay, so to become integrated, we have greater and greater awareness of those aspects. So, and this concept of integration actually was described to me by an order member by this analogy of a sort of, imagine a lighthouse with the lights sort of spreading out in all directions. So for instance, our minds can have many different thoughts racing around, bubbling up at all different times, and that is an unintegrated self. But to become integrated is to take, in that concept of the lighthouse, to take all that light and focus it down to a very narrow beam in a particular direction. And the similar thing can happen with our internal life. So our thoughts, rather than being in all different directions and pulling us in very different directions, can become very, very integrated and push us in just one direction, that will move us further along the path, essentially. So in this talk, Sangharakshita uses this concept, or uses definition of the self, basically, as personality regarded as an agent conscious of her own continuing identity, basically. That's how he's defining the self. So within Buddhism, there's this concept of anatta or anatman. So it comes from the Sanskrit anatman, basically, and this is sort of I guess you can kind of translate it as no self, on non-self. So an meaning negation and atta meaning self. And I guess the clue is in the word, right? Because it's a negation of self, right? So so to understand anatta, you have to, or anatta, you have to understand. You can only really understand it after you've understood the concept of self, the self concept first, basically. And there's a bit of confusion. Certainly, I had a little bit of confusion with this myself as I kind of encountered this concept. So, so quite often people will talk about within Buddhism, talk about the idea that sort of the denial of the self, right? So that the denial that the self exists, or that that the self is that, you know, that it's a delusion, an illusion that there is a self, and actually this is incorrect. So basically, what the Buddha was negating was the concept that the self is permanent. Okay, so the concept that there is a permanent, unchanging self is the thing that the Buddha is refuting. So he emphatically didn't teach that that the self does not exist. It does exist, and neither did he teach that our experience of the self is delusion. So we definitely do experience, and I have experienced self as a clear kind of concept. Okay, so. And the other thing that Sangharakshita talks about is that anatta is not a metaphysical concept. So we're not here talking, you know, in quite abstract metaphysical terms. Really, what we're talking about is a practical tool for seeing how we can change ourselves, and then doing so we can tread the path, and ultimately, this is what we'll talk about in a short while. Transcend the self. So not get rid of the self, but actually transcend the self. So there's another talk I looked at recently that Yana Vacha gave at the LBC called Facing Yourself. So this is part of a larger series of talks, and there are various things within that which I found very interesting and inspiring to hear about. So so one of these one of the concepts of this split that we talked about before, the conscious, the subconscious parts of ourselves. So this idea that we don't fully know ourselves, we're not fully integrated. This really is the root of the mind-made suffering that we experience in our lives. So we can unpack that a little bit more. So basically, well, let's talk a little bit first actually about integration. So basically, with integration, we are basically becoming aware of the conditioning. So I talked a little bit earlier about conditioning, and that comes in various forms. So that it can be societal, and it can be to do with gender. It can be cultural. So there might be societal norms around gender roles, for instance. And the thing is that these things they are taught to us when we're young, and so we incorporate them in the way that we in our biases, in the way that we operate, and our self concept incorporates a lot of these societal norms as conditioned aspects of ourselves. And because they are pervasive in our society, they become we become unaware that that's actually what's going on, because we see it around us all the time. So that's one aspect of how we become unaware of that side of it. So coming back to this idea of how our alienated awareness generates suffering. So Anatman is one of the laksanas. So an aksana is a mark of the conditioned experience. Okay, so in contrast, when we talk about unconditioned existence, basically to have unconditioned experience is when we transcend the self, basically, and so we want to look a little bit more at why this causes suffering. So I looked a little bit at the we had the Mitra study course that we myself and other Mitras here in the UK study. I think you may study there in India as well, actually. So from the first year course, there was a section on this particular subject, okay, and it's talking about how the Buddha came to refute this concept of the sort of immutable fixed self, okay, and the way he did this was to look and account for everything that we observe under a number of different headings. So those headings are or categories are form, feeling, perception, volitions, and acts of consciousness. Okay, and so in observing these, he noted that these categories are that none of them are permanent, essentially. So they're all impermanent, and because of that, that then leads to suffering, essentially, because there's no permanence attached to those aspects of observation of experience. So essentially, then our task, the task at hand, basically, is to cultivate greater awareness of ourselves, and this isn't to get rid of the self. So we might think, well, if this conditioned experience leads to suffering, then actually what we want to try and achieve is to get rid of the self, right? That would be because if that's what's, if the self is actually causing suffering, we don't want suffering, so we'll get rid of the self. So in fact, this kind of isn't going to help. This isn't actually going to solve our problem, basically. So basically, we're, rather than trying to destroy or get rid of the self or disavow the self, we really want to understand ourselves as much as we could possibly can. And we want to do that because the more we can understand about ourselves, the greater the possibility is of transcending ourselves. So we want to transcend ourselves into something higher that is beyond ourselves. So we don't want to be stuck and fixed within this world of the self, because we acknowledge that it's there, and we acknowledge that it's changing, but it doesn't provide the permanence that we need to alleviate the suffering that we experience. So going back to what Jan Vacha was saying in his talk, so on the practical side of it, so we should start by being relatively stable position in terms of our level of integration before we can go further along the path to greater self-understanding and wisdom, basically. And so we want to cultivate skillful positive intent to do that, essentially. And we need to take responsibility for our conditioning. So as we become more aware, we then become aware of our conditioning, and we become aware of how that conditioning affects the way that we see ourselves and the way that we act in the world. Okay, so one of the aspects of doing this, basically, or of cultivating greater awareness, is through the people that we're in relationship with, basically. So this is in general, it's people within our families, our friends, and particularly our spiritual friendships within the Sangha. So and in fact, one of the things that I've the kind of the greatest support that I've got really from doing Buddhism, actually, is through the Sangha, through my friends, and the way that they can hold a mirror up to me, actually, in a way that shows me with greater clarity about myself, basically. And in fact, really the main reason that I came to Buddhism, even though I didn't quite understand this at the time, was that there was a moment in my life where I found that I was able to hold a mirror up to myself, basically, and I was able to see more of myself than I'd ever seen before. And in doing so, I realized that I wasn't really leading the life that I wanted to be leading at that point. Okay, so this is one of the ways that we can to have greater awareness is to find ways in which we can hold a mirror up to ourselves, to see ourselves in a way that that we have essentially become blind to, or that we over time have found ways of simply ignoring. So becoming aware of the things that we've ignored about ourselves. And it's also it's very tempting, and I thought about this quite recently, actually. So when you encounter this concept that the self isn't fixed, it can change, then that also can become quite. You can be quite captivated with the idea that actually, okay, if it's not fixed, then I'm just free to choose a self that I prefer. Okay, and this isn't going to work either, actually. So we can't really freely choose a self, of our own, desire, basically, because in doing so, we would have to essentially disavow ourselves or push away the parts of ourselves that we don't like. And in doing that, we essentially don't acknowledge that those parts exist. So it's not about about changing the self, but in fact it's about just simply being present and aware of what is the self, basically. That. So now kind of bringing these ideas together and drawing them into a kind of conclusion here. So essentially, what we aim to do is to practice through various means, to practice greater and greater awareness of ourselves. So one aspect is through through spiritual friendship. The other aspect is through meditation, so greater awareness in that respect, and also through ethical practice, so we can understand more about our own selves through how we react in leading our lives in a more ethical way. These are various aspects that we can use to cultivate this greater level of awareness. And the reason that we would choose to want to do this is that we would ultimately then wish to transcend the self, and that really is kind of the view that's the path that we're on in terms of Buddhism. So I think I don't know how I'm doing for time, actually, but I think at that point I'll kind of draw things to a sort of a conclusion, and and maybe invite questions that anyone might have for me. I'll try to answer them as best I can. But there we go.